Hello, and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. And please summon someone else. No. Actually, I'm responding again to more of the comments that I've gotten on some of these videos on DSA strategy. And this has made this series longer and longer. I know some people wanted me to go back to other things, so I will. But this actually gets me talk about a bunch of different organizational forms, their strengths and their weaknesses and how we're going to overcome them. But so let's just get to the comment. And as always, I didn't even correct this one. I'm just going to read it as is, but I stripped the names off in a document so that you can't, harass the commenter if you disagree with them. I just don't want that kind of shit to happen under my name. All right. Let's pull up the comment so you can see it. Let's make that bigger. Sorry to hit you with the nominal. Hey Varn, love your series. Love your recent series on your criticism of DSA strategy, and I'm very excited for you and Daniel's book. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the different forms of organization and their limitations. You've talked a lot about labor unions because I'm in one, and I'm a rep for one, and I've been an organizer around trying to help labor unions come to be for a long time. The first time I tried to organize for labor unions was organizing TAs, actually, as much as I complained about that. And being told that if I continued that I would get kicked out of school because what I was advocating for was illegal under Georgia law. That was 22 years ago. I was not even a leftist at the time. So keep that in mind. Anyway, so in recent developments in the labor movement, most of which are bad. Not all. I mean, there has been a return of rank and file stuff, but it's actually a lot more limited than what you'd expect, given that you hear so much about it. And then there's a tale of two Sean Fain and Sean O'Brien. I think we made Sean Fain too famous too quickly without realizing the structural limitations of the UAW. And then Sean O'Brien has tended towards a more right-wing base, which makes sense given the nature of what the Teamsters are in. And I'm going to talk a lot about different kinds of labor unions and whatnot today, too, and their structures. I was wondering if you guys had thoughts on community organizations, community worker organizations, as well as renters unions and other non-labor union forms of working class organization. Thanks. Here's the thing. I do. A lot of them, and a lot of them are unpopular. I'm just going to tell you, for example, renters unions are very popular right now for a variety of reasons. Our tenants unions. I think tenants unions are interesting because they structurally have a much lower bar of entry. Most people in the working class are tenants, although not all, and particularly younger people, and they're likely to stay that way for a while. But they have a much higher bar of trying to achieve success for structural reasons. And when I get into it, it's going to make people a little bit uncomfortable, I think. But it's just something you need to think about. And other non-labor union forms of working class organization. I mean, obviously, I am technically in a advocacy nonprofit, aka a party surrogate that really can't do that yet, aka the DSA. I have been in sects before. I've been in several socialist and communist sects, and I was a fellow traveler for the Socialist Party of the United States, the other successor organization from the death of the SPA. So there's two. There was DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which joined with NAM to form the DSA in 1982, and then there was the SPUSA, which its fortunes have waxed and waned, but they've never been particularly large. I was a fellow traveler from about 2009 to the end of the Alexander campaign in 2012. I was abroad in another country, so I could not be a member. And also when I was in the United States in 2008, 2009, I was in a state that had no chapter because Georgia at the time had no chapter of almost anything. And I don't even think there was a DSA chapter back then. There is now. There's even a DSA chapter in my, moderately sized ex-mill town of a hometown, Macon, Georgia. There may even be one in Augusta, Georgia, where I was born. And for those of you who don't know anything about Georgia, those are like Macon, Georgia was like considered kind of the third worst city to live in after Detroit and the aughts and aught teens. It's still pretty bad. All right, so let's go into this. I think it's great that you're looking into DSA strategy and are looking forward to The People Are Not One. Daniel and I put a lot into the framework of the book. Daniel did a lot of theoretical work. I did a lot more of the empirical work. I'll do some theory. And it's not a long book, and it's probably going to need several sequels, frankly. And the relationship between organizable forms and working class agency is at the heart of the project, although I'm going to admit we didn't go into specifics in that book. We may in future ones. So people ask me about tenants organizing. We mention it kind of offhand. When looking at mass organization, the fundamental issue is a point of structural leverage and how the organization mediates between the working class and either capital, the state, or their NTAs, depending on what your focus is on. Each organizational form has inherent limits that are baked into its design, both legally and formally. So let's break down how these non-labor unions function, as well as different forms of labor unions, where they hit the wall, how they make contrast with the traditional forms of labor unions and what the traditional forms of labor unions are, and why a party is important partially to emerge and coordinate these different kinds of organizations. Okay, so renter/tenant unions. We're going to call them both. Tenant unions have seen a major resurgence lately, and for good reason. Housing costs are the primary vector of working class immiseration at right now, although that's spreading. I think it was probably more true that it was the primary cause post-COVID. Now there's a bunch of causes. The leverage point is that is different for a tenant union than a labor union, and this actually is going to be important for understanding why I said in the beginning there is a structural limit to capacity for tenants unions that are not there for labor unions. However, unlike labor unions, they have a much lower bar of entry and a much broader function portions of the class who can access them, because labor unions are often tied to things that can be unionized easily. That's public sector jobs and industrial jobs, service jobs and franchise jobs, and a bunch of other kinds of jobs are hard to unionize because you don't get a lot of people per shop. And I can talk about that too. There's also just structural different things in labor unions. We shouldn't just think about business unions as the only form of these, and we'll talk about that in a while as well. So the leverage point for a labor union is rent strikes, which is collective withholding of revenues for landlords. But I'll talk about the problems with this in a minute. So what are the key limitations of tenant unions? They have highly atomized adversaries that do not actually have a supply chain. Unlike a single factory owner or a massive corporation with centralized logistics, the housing market is deeply fragmented by its very nature. A tenant union often finds itself fighting dozens of different small-time landlords, sometimes in many different states, covered by many different laws. And also you have LLCs and property management firms that you deal with that are also not necessarily covered by the same laws as landlords. This makes scaling up past building by building or complex by complex incredibly difficult. All right. Although getting members in is a lot easier because the barrier to entry is just being a renter. There is also more asymmetry in the threat. The state is explicitly organized to protect private property rights more than anything else. That's what a capitalist state does. That's why it's tolerated, even. The legal mechanism for eviction is swift in some states, although it can be slowed down by law, but then by law it can also be reversed, and backed by state violence, bailiffs, sheriffs, police forces, etc. A failed labor strike means a lost paycheck. A failed rent strike can mean immediate homelessness. Massively raising the stakes for participants without necessarily raising the stakes on the landlords. And we'll get into that. Renting is a relationship of consumption. Or if you want to be completely about it, it's about the reproduction of labor power in the market. It's a form of social reproduction, which is also consumptive. It is not part of production at any way. While you can successfully squeeze a individual landlord's cash flow if you have enough people in a concentrated area, it doesn't possess the systemic choke potentials of halting logistics, energy, or manufacturing. It just doesn't. Furthermore, it is easier for landlords to hold out because their property values are still valuable for longer than no commodities being able to be sold. All right. What about community workers associations or worker centers? I'm a member of one, not a member of a tenants union because there's none out here where I live. There are some in the Salt Lake Valley. I support them as best I can, but they don't represent me, and I don't have that kind of landlord anyway. I actually am proof of the problem in that I have an individual landlord that actually has a property management company handling it. And since I'm in a small domicile with like one other family, there's not really a whole lot of collective stuff that can go on here. The property management company and I think the landlord themselves actually owns diffuse properties all throughout Utah, not just in the valley, and they are diffuse. See what I'm talking about here. So worker centers and community-based workers organizations generally emerge where traditional labor unions have failed or legally cannot go, especially amongst undocumented workers, day laborers, domestic workers. Gig economy actors are pre-majority unionism, which is the code word for trying to start a union when you don't have one. This has been really pushed by some particular unions. The CWA is particularly involved here, but there's many that get involved. The leverage point. They rely on community solidarity, legal advice, reputational damage against abusive employers rather than institutionalized collective bargaining agreements or strikes. One of their key limitations, frankly, is they lack a strategic choke point. Because they operate primarily in highly precarious, informal, and low capital sectors, or in highly professionalized sectors, like frankly, my worker center works with both nurses and a lot of bars and like ski patrolmen, but we don't have a lot of representation in the broader union movement. The busing, the city buses union is not in it. The firemen's union is not involved. I don't even think the miners are all that involved. So because of that, they lack the structural leverage to disrupt the broader economy, since also solidarity strikes are largely illegal. However, their advantage is that they allow unions to informally coordinate with each other. So, for example, the CWA and the teachers organizations and all this can somewhat coordinate with smaller unions. Like for here, it's like the Ski Patrollers United and like Suntrap United and a bunch of other small unions who are also affiliated with unions that are not normally in those fields. Jurisdictional issues actually becomes a problem for us, and we just try to like not deal with it. So you know, I was usually involved in it. I spent 3 months on the central committee of one of these unions, helping writing bylaws, and then got injured and kind of was less involved, although I still do show up for things. When it comes to day laborers and whatnot, day laborers strike a specific corner. The immediate impact on capital accumulation is minimal. compared to a longshoreman or a rail strike. Although that's also why the railroads are prohibited from striking. I mean, we saw this under Biden. But the reason why the railroads are kept under like guild union law, so the professions within the railroad are unionized, but the union itself is not sectoralized, was to stop a strategic choke point from developing for national security reasons. And I think, despite what some of the even rail union leadership wanted, it was very clear that the leadership collaborated with parts of the Democratic Party to betray their base. And I'm sorry about that. I know that makes some people who are AOC defenders really unhappy, but it's a fact. Because the union leadership were trying to undermine the vote of the union itself. And when people defend that say the union want that, they mean the union leadership wanted it. Because they thought they could get a backdoor deal. But that is not what the base thought. And the votes in the union back that up. Anyway, our unions plural. So in the United States, they've already know the strategic choke points. And we've also seen people turn on municipal rail strikes and bus strikes too, because they hurt the people. Well, of course they do. That's part of the fucking point. Another limit of community workers organizations and worker centers is they're given to NGOification. Because these organizations cannot rely on steady membership dues automatically deducted from a steady payroll, although that's increasingly not true for public sector unions. We don't do automatic deductions anymore. We do like EFTs and shit, because I'm not going to talk about and totally why, but we don't necessarily want everyone to know who is a member of a union. They are frequently forced to rely on foundation grants, philanthropic capital, or just the largesse of a particular union in the worker center coalition. The NGOification subtly but surely shifts their accountability away from rank and file membership and towards the foundation funders or the specific union that's funding them, neutralizing their radical potential and turning them into social service providers. And you see this a lot with mutual aid too. All right, what about community organizations, neighborhood assemblies, aka the Alinsky model? So these are geographically bound organizations targeting municipal issues, usually very specific municipal issues, everything from opposing gentrification to food deserts to mutual aid networks and demanding local goods. The leverage point comes from geographic density and electoral pressure pretty much alone on local city councils or municipal bodies, as well as the ability to leverage influence in the courts. So it's mostly legal and electoral. Key limitations. Highly cross-class contamination. Neighborhoods are rarely uniform in class composition. A community organization really readily absorbs small property owners, shopkeepers, and other forms of gentrifiers, not just blue-collar proletarians, although I don't have a problem with white-collar gentrifiers if they're actually on the wage fund being part of something. I want to be clear on that. Because the interests of small landlords or local businesses fundamentally diverge from wage labor, even more than the different sectors of wage labor diverge from each other, these organizations can easily devolve into YIMBY or NIMBYism, or vague populism that obscures class conflict. These groups are also almost entirely reactive. I did not say reactionary, I said reactive. They form to stop a highway being built, or protest a police killing, or fight a zoning law, or lead a hashtag movement for one of those reasons. Once the immediate crisis passes or the city council makes a minor concession, the organic glue holding the organization together tends to dissolve. And if it doesn't dissolve, you have the NGOification problem here even more than you do in the worker center. The other thing that you have to deal with is a lot of the models for building these community organizations, such as the Alinsky model, is kind of like the McAlevey model in labor unions. It focuses on staffers ultimately and trying to create a staffer like intermediary between the general public and politicians. The limitation that tracks across all these non-labor forms is that they deal with the reproduction of the working class rather than the production of capital itself. They're essentially defensive sites of struggle. They keep people housed, fed, and alive, and you can't have a movement if people aren't housed, fed, and alive, but they generally lack the offensive capacity to transform the mode of production since they're not touching production. A real working class strategy can't champion one of these forms over the others. The trick is understanding how a tenant union or a community organization can serve as an entry point for class consciousness, or for helping build community links in otherwise decimated and atomized working class neighborhoods, thus fighting the problems of lumpenization, which I talk a lot about in the little pamphlet I wrote with Daniel. Daniel Tutt of Emancipation podcast. They lack structural disruptive power in the economy that organized layer has at the point of production. They also aren't generally given toward being militant, and so they also have a hard time dealing with systemic violence, frankly. Which leads to the whole thing I've talked about is most left-wing militias are like weird parodies of right-wing gun culture, so they're not really militias in any meaningful sense, nonetheless. So I want to talk about a specific tenants union that everyone fucking loves, that I do actually want to defend, but I want to talk about its problems and why I think the tenant union answer as an alternative, it's vital. I want to be very clear. Tenant unions are vital to the movement right now, but they cannot substitute for traditional labor unions for reasons I'm going to get into. I'm going to pick on the Los Angeles tenant union because it's the largest autonomous dues-driven tenant union that's not primarily a legal defense fund in the United States. I'm going to talk about its successes and its failures, and I don't think people talk a lot about its failures, but we are going to talk about them, and then how its failures often lead other tenants unions to adopt more legalistic ways of fighting capital, which are themselves a problem, although it's a different problem. So the LATU operates outside of traditional nonprofit state-funded models. The LATU's success is stemmed from its commitment to horizontal local organizing and direct action rather than institutional lobbying. It has achieved major achievements from collective bargaining, landmark strikes, and policy influence, but it has structural limitations that we can talk about. One, the LATU's most tangible victories comes from using rent strikes, not just as a defensive measure against eviction, but as an offensive tool to force landlords to the negotiating table, which is sort of an importation of labor union tactics in the housing. The biggest one of these is probably the Boyle Heights / Marachi Plaza victory, and a super high profile victory. The LATU led the tenants of Mariachi Apartments who faced rent hikes of up to 80%. After a grueling year-long rent strike backed by the LATU's Union de Vecinos chapter, the tenant union successfully forced the landlord to sign a collective bargaining agreement. This effectively established a localized version of rent control and guaranteed the right to remain in their homes. The LATU helped coordinate what became the largest rent strike in Los Angeles history in the Westlake Burlington strike. And so the tenant union struck over severe habitability issues and predatory rent hikes, winning landmark housing court battles that legally slashed their rent obligations to near zero until repairs were executed, setting a precedent for collective tenant bargaining in court, which is a big deal, but also has severe limitations because once it's in court, it also is monitored and regulated that way. So the LATU consciously avoids relying on relationships with politicians, and its ability to disrupt city operations and create public spectacles has forced the hand of local legislatures. During the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, the LATU orchestrated a sustained direct action, including days of protest outside of Mayor Eric Garcetti's mansion and City Hall. This militant mobilization was instrumental in forcing the city to adopt some more aggressive emergency victim moratoriums and anti-harassment ordinances in the county. There was also the 2023 Universal Just Cause protections, the momentum from the LATU's neighborhood organizing alongside a coalition of other advocacy groups and NGOs, and this is important because they needed them, formed a group called Keep LA Housed, culminating in LA City Council passing a monumental tenants protection in early 2023. But I want you to think about this. This is still largely legal. These included universal just cause for evictions, establishing monetary threshold for non-payment for evictions, preventing people from being evicted over minor short-term debt, and mandatory relocation incentives for tenants displaced by steep rent increases. This led to the Hillside Villa struggle, organizing with the Hillside Villa Tenants Association, and Chinatown successfully forced the city into a historic public debate over eminent domain. Faced with the expiration of affordable housing covenants that would have triggered a massive displacement, the LATU's organizing forced the city hall to vote to advance fund about $15 million in rent assistance and explore outright municipal purchases of buildings to preserve affordability in the area. They also were trying to combat art washing and gentrification. I think some of this is interesting. LATU has successfully linked residential displacements with cultural forces that facilitate it. So, through the Boyle Heights Allegiance Against Art Washing and Displacement, BHAAAD, LATU and its allies targeted speculative art galleries that were moving into working class immigrant neighborhoods to alter local real estate logic. Through sustained picketing, boycotts, and direct community pressure, they forced the art gallery exodus out of Boyle Heights, successfully preserving the neighborhood's commercial and social fabric. Well, kind of firm, immediate, speculative redevelopment. Although we're seeing progressive politicians in New York, Donnie, actually side with speculative redevelopment in their YIMBYism to try to lower housing costs. And we'll talk about this because rezoning is going to be interesting. So another big thing the LATU has cared about was language justice. And by this, we don't mean language justice in the use all the woke words sense. We mean that local meetings should use some translation like we do in schools, at least for Spanish and English, so that people are aware of their rights and have a role in strategic decision making. I totally suggest, like, this is language justice I support, as opposed to, like, I don't know, shaming people for the way they speak. Unfortunately, language justice refers to both things. Scalable autonomy. The LATU successfully scales its organizational model across many distinct tiers. So there's tenant owners organizations with specific buildings, local chapters within distinct neighborhoods, centralized unions spanning the entire city. This prevents the total centralization of power and ensures that when an individual tenant faces illegal evictions, there's local response committees that can apply direct action. They also started shifting the narrative from the housing crisis to tenant rights crisis. LATU has successfully demonstrated organized renters can wield veto power over some real estate speculation in a major global metropolis. But, and there's a lot of buts here, and I want to talk about this when we're talking about tenants unions, because I think LATU is one of the most successful, and it's why it's used as a model in the DSA. It's why the Communist Caucus loves it so much. But there are problems. Well, the LA Tenants Union has successfully pioneered large-scale autonomous organizing and altered the discourse around renters' rights. It doesn't have the organizational structures to really deal with some long-term problems. By prioritizing horizontal power and injecting institutional compromise, the union frequently faces structural friction when attempting to secure long-term systemic stability for the tenants it organizes with. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. It's a primary failures and structural critiques can be broken down into a couple different areas, and I think we should. So, one, there's a strategy of permanent crisis and a vulnerability to retaliation once sites are over. And there's an over-reliance on the law, even with the LATU, and it's even more so with less autonomous member-funded tenants unions. The LATU's reliance on direct action over legalist reform, I mean, victories are often highly intense but structurally precarious. So, because the LATU frequently rejects formal state-sanctioned collective bargaining frameworks, which do not exist for tenants in any way, that the NLRA does to protect certain kinds of labor unions, although most labor unions actually aren't covered by the NLRA, and thus they're not subject to the NLRB. That's all public sector unions, and believe it or not, a lot of private sector unions that are still forced to be organized as guild unions because they were exempted for national security reasons all the way back in the 30s. A run-win strike does not guarantee a permanent peace. So landlords routinely wait for the immediate media attention and activist presence to fade, and they deploy legal countermeasures, such as the Ellis Act, which allows landlords to evict if they plan to exit the rental market and thus sell it. So the landlord can evict and then sell the property to another landlord, but there's nothing you can do about it because it's covered by the Ellis Act. are targeted owner move-in evictions, where the owner moves into the apartment and technically lives there, and they can evict whoever they want. The LATU can successfully block an eviction physically or even orchestrate a mass court defense. But the sheer volume of Los Angeles evictions often overwhelms the grassroots defense network. They can't handle everything. When cases escalate to formal unlawful detainer trials, tenants frequently require traditional institutional legal representation from like the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, exposing a reliance on the very nonprofit infrastructure that the LATU critiques. And this is important because while they critique formal agreements, their biggest successes are formal legal agreements, which are necessarily defensive. So the LATU is a strict anti-collaborative stance towards municipal government, real estate developers, and traditional nonprofits, viewing them as co-op agents of capital. I think they're right to that to some degree. While it preserves their radical independence, it often leads to tactical deadlocks. So we look at the Hillside Villa campaign, which I mentioned earlier. The years-long struggle with the Hillside Villa apartment in Chinatown Heights highlights the limits of forcing the state's hand. While the LATU and the Hillside Villa Tenants Association successfully forced the Seattle County to vote in favor of using eminent domain to buy buildings to protect housing affordability, the actual implementation has stalled in bureaucratic and financial quagmires for years now. Because the LATU refuses to engage in traditional backroom lobbying and compromise on municipal policy judgments, it has struggled to force the city to actually execute the purpose, which has left the tenants in that villa in a state of prolonged legal limbo and ongoing vulnerability to housing violations and eviction. Still happening. So even though it was a major legal success, the nature of the law, which they rightly critiqued, means that it hasn't fully been implemented. So part of the problem of both opposing and using something at the same time is that you can get tied up in quagmires very easily. This happens in traditional labor unions too. So this is not unique to tenants unions, but I think we have to really talk about it. So one of the other things that has happened is by refusing to participate in drafting housing legislation, because, why would you do that? Are endorsing pro-tenant union political candidates, which I actually agree with them, that we should not be endorsing candidates as much as we do in the DSA or in any fucking socialist organization, frankly. The LATU effectively abrogates legislative arena to more moderate nonprofits that are there, sometimes in coalition with, like Keep LA House, which I mentioned earlier. So while LATU's militancy provides a radical flank that pushes politicians to act, the union does not control the pen when the laws are written and cannot interface with the implementation of the laws in any way, sometimes resulting in watered down municipal compromises that fail to meet the union's original demands, but are seen in the public as a victory. So the public moves on and the pressure diffuses. And then there's the structural limits of a dues-funded volunteer model. I've talked about this with the IWW2. The LATU prides itself on being entirely funded by member dues, which I also think is prideful for good for things like DSA, to avoid the nonprofit industrial complex. However, this case admits resource scarcity when fighting multi-million-dollar real estate syndicates who can wait them out. The other thing that happens is burnout, which is bad in almost all of these member dues organizations. Organizing a city as a vast and atomized as Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is highly atomized. It's maddening to try to deal with that fucking city. I fucking hate living there. I don't live there, but every time I go through it, I'm like having nightmare lands. I'm such a East Coaster. But anyway, because the LATU relies on almost exclusively on volunteer and uncompensated organizers, it suffers from high rates of activism. Burnout. This creates a sharp asymmetry. Tenants and volunteer organizers are fighting in their spare time under immense emotional and economic stress, where corporate landlords employ full-time professional legal teams and property management firms whose sole job is to manage the dispute and wait them out, and they're paid to do so. The other thing is there's an uneven geographic capability. So while the LATU is highly functional, robust chapters in specific neighborhoods, Boyle Heights, Central LA, Vibey, its presence in the vast expanses of the San Fernando Valley, South LA, or the West Side is more uneven. And this is where this is a problem, because some of those are even more precarious and fraught. The model scales effectively when pre-existing social fabrics or high-density housing exist, But the struggles to maintain consistent and power in more suburban or geographically isolated pockets of the country is just not there. And this is going to be a big problem because the working class in America looks a lot more like the working class in Europe and where it lives. We've had the reverse donification of a lot of places. So in the 20th century, there's a tendency of the urban cores to be neglected, to be full of people who work there, but they had infrastructure and high density. But today, and I definitely see this in Salt Lake and a lot of other places outside of like a few major metropoles, aka LA and New York, what you have is working class people being forced further and further out into the suburban areas as the urban core is gentrified under new urbanism, which is something that's interesting because I used to be a supporter of new urbanism, but it's led to massive gentrification. So, for example, in the Salt Lake Valley where I live in Salt Lake, the west side used to be the poor side of the city, the east bench is the rich side. But what we've seen is instead of it being the side of the city, the old residential boom neighborhoods built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the suburban areas are now full of working class people who've been pushed out of the city, who need homes bigger than the small, high density tenant unions because they have kids. I mean, so there's all these like places downtown that are full of 1-bedroom apartments, but in maybe 2-bedroom apartments, so you can deal with one kid. But if you're a Hispanic or Mormon family and there's a lot of them out here with more than 1 or 2 kids, you're often going to be renting a house for multiple families and multiple generations out in the suburbs where they're cheaper now. But what's not there is easy transportation, that much mass transit, although we do have some. But like the further out on the west side you get, the less mass transit there is here in Salt Lake. And that's true for a lot of places. The same developmental pattern happened in Atlanta. It's happened in a whole lot of areas. It's actually weird in LA and in New York that you still have so much urban poverty and so much wealth right by each other. So these models don't scale any better outside of the major metropole. And I'm sorry, but if you're trying to do a national project at all, you have to be able to scale outside of the major progressive metropoles. So the LATU's greatest strength is its uncompromising extra-legal independence, but it's also a source of many of its significant failures. It excels at disruption, narrative shifting, crisis mobilization, and forcing landlords' hand in specific instances, but it struggles to translate that disruptive power into durable, legally binding, resource-secure protections, or in movements that can leak up outside of LA to do larger pushbacks and deal with tenants organization and the larger working class. Yes. So when we look at traditional labor unions, we have some things to look at too. The way they are categorized usually comes down to who they organize and how they position themselves relative to the productive process. There are different organizational models in traditional labor unions that have different types of leverage, internal cultures, and strategic limitations. Historically and theoretically, traditional labor unions are broken down into 4, maybe 5 categories. Craft unions are also sometimes called guild unions. Craft unions focus on workers based on a specific trade, skill set, or occupation. Often they're full of contractors too. You see this in like the carpenters union and the electricians union. Regardless of the industry or workplace they happen to be in. A craft union might represent all electricians, plumbers, carpenters, railroad engineers, etc., across an entire city or state, even if those workers are spread over dozens of different construction companies, film sets, or manufacturing plants. This is how a lot of the freelancers union and all that works. Their leverage relies on monopolizing skilled labor more than strikes. Because the employee cannot easily replace a trained worker, the union can enforce high standards, strict wage scales, and control the entry into the trade via apprenticeship programs. But they cannot structurally strike in the same way. This form is inherently exclusionary. It tends to create a labor aristocracy. This is what Engels was talking about where skilled workers protect their own turf while ignoring or even sometimes actively undermining, such as I once heard an engineers union opposing universal health care because it would undercut one of the benefits they got for their clients. The struggles of lesser unskilled labor. They also can't really do massive mobilizations because they're not centrally concentrated in any key way. So it fragments the workplace along occupational lines, making wall-to-wall solidarity difficult, which is exactly why the rail unions are organized this way, and the state keeps it that way so that they can't all agree to go on strike in the same way. So then there are industrial unions or business unions. Now, I'm going to say that industrial unions and business unions aren't technically the same thing, but they are related. All right. So industrial unionism comes from all workers within a specific industry, regardless of their skill level or job description, into the single union. So, for example, my association, which is only sometimes a union, depending on when you're talking to people, for example, my workplace has two different unions that are both affiliated with the NEA, but they don't bargain together. And in fact, we've been played off of each other. And that is the licensed union, which is the teachers union, but also has administration in it, which is fucking weird. In my state, that's not true in other states. It's not true for all NEA branches. It's a UEA development. What we see we see like the lunch ladies and stuff have a union, but it's a different union, and the administrators and the school board will often play us off of each other. So in my state, the UEA is, as a subsidiary of the business, is a guild union. In other states, that's not true. So there are states, for example, I think a lot of the Midwestern states, the lunch ladies are in the same union as the teachers, and administration aren't. So some unions will be guild unions in some places and industrial unions in other, or general unions in another, and I'll get to that in a minute. So industrial/business unions. Why do we sometimes call them business unions? This language is really taken from the IWW. Because they deal in working and organizing along business lines. But anyway, in an automotive plant organized in an industrial model, the assembly worker, the janitor, the forklift driver, and the skilled tool and die maker are all members of the same local, which means that they are sectionally organized, at least within the firm. In Europe, there are sectional unions that have sectional bargaining power for like multiple industries at once. In America, that's not the case. We don't have sectional bargaining. We have firm level bargaining, but industrial unions at least include all types of jobs within the firm in their union except management. But what are the limitations of industrial unions? Well, there's two problems, and we're going to talk about one of them. Because they cover vast numbers of workers across massive corporate structures, industrial unions are highly susceptible to high levels of rapid bureaucratization and overhead. The scale requires an army of staff, lawyers, and representatives who are not part of the rank and file, which often leads to professional leadership caste that prioritizes labor peace and contract enforcement over militancy and strikes, and also proving that they have control over labor means often suppressing strikes. Otherwise, the rank and file bargaining doesn't really work. So this led to in the mid 20th century things like the unions actually union staff even sometimes being paid in company stock and shit. Like, I'm not joking. And that even include rank and file voted in reps. So for example, my union president is half paid by the union, half paid by my school board. You can see the conflict of interest there. Now I say this because, for all the talk about unions that you hear on the left, there's not that many people actually in them. And we'll get into that in a minute. Then there are general unions, and there's a lot of unions that used to be industrial or business unions that are now general unions. General unions organize people across multiple different unrelated industries and occupations. And in fact, both the Teamsters and the UWA are this because their original fields have been hurt over time. A general union might simultaneously represent healthcare workers, public transit drivers, university grad students, and factory workers. The UWA does this now. UWA, the Auto Workers Union, represents a lot of TAs. And I've been critical of this, even though I think TAs deserve a union. But because from the standpoint of rank and file organizing, you get a lot of militant people who are very highly educated but do not stay in the union because they're not TAs for more than 4 or 5 years, which means you don't have accumulated institutional knowledge, and you do have a form of money that doesn't require a whole lot of oversight. I know that's cynical, but it's often fucking true. So that's why the TAs have been something a lot of different kinds of unions want to go into, even though you would think they would be part of the CWA or the government workers union or the office workers unions, but they're not. Their power is diversified and financial because they aren't tied to the economic health of a senior industry. A downturn in manufacturing won't bankrupt the union if its healthcare and public sector branches are still strong. It has a massive pool of resources and strike funds. But the problem is it has a lack of organic focus and no real incentive to use the strike funds for large parts of the people in the union. Because its membership is so heterogeneous, it is incredibly difficult to build a shared identity or cohesive sectorized strategy. I mean, and a lot of these unions are doing this because without it, they would die because their industries are in such decline. UAW, big one for the UAW. The union can end up functioning less like an organic working class vehicle, more like a centralized legal services provider for fragmented shops who often do not have the power to use its backing for strikes in their field anyway. Now, then there are solidaristic direct action unions, which are called class rider revolutionary unions. These are the one big union model. The historical example of this is the IWW. I've talked about my complaints about the IWW. They tend to avoid relying on state-sanctioned collective bargaining laws. Government-certified electors are formal long-term contracts that legally bind workers not to strike, so they refuse to take no strike clauses. They often rely on constant agitation, minority unionism, and direct action on the shop floor. The problem is they can't get fucking contracts. Even when they do get contracts, they often don't do very well. And like the IWWs probably have more success organizing prisons and like small franchises that it often can't get contracts for than it's been able to do anything else. Their power is largely ideological, and they're highly disrupted because they can do cross-sectional striking and bypass bureaucratic and legal traps that bind unions to things that are obviously not in their interest, like no strike clauses and mandatory arbitration. They can move fast, strike spontaneously and extra legally, and foster deep class consciousness, but they don't have institutional stabilization of formal contracts and legally enforced dues collection. These unions find it incredibly difficult to sustain structures over time. I mean, there's a long part of the IWW where it was basically a historical reenactment society. I'm sorry, it's true. It's not true. That wasn't true. That hasn't been true for about 15 years, but there was a long period of time where it was. They experienced massive spikes of intense militancy during economic crises or housing crises or like during COVID, but they also experienced rapid contraction and fragmentation when the immediate crisis struggle cools down because they're based on basically volunteer action. The last of these kind of unions is public sector unions, which work a lot like industrial unions, are craft unions, depending on the part of the public sector they're in. And like I said, with teachers unions, they do both, depending on what state, because their charters and structures are decided by local state law, and they interface with the state governments and not even with the NCLB, and definitely not with industry. Understanding these categories helps classify why the labor movement behaves the way it does and why there's a structural problem right now, because industrial unions were the most, and sectionally organized industrial unions like we see in Europe were the best ways to get leverage outside of legal protections that can be kind of undone politically. That we had, because you had mass amounts of labor concentrated in one place, over multiple sections, and this could be used in coordination with a party to build broad class solidarity, understanding of class leadership, and to tie in skilled labor and unskilled labor, and even sometimes tie in white and blue collar workers together. All right. Now, let's talk about this. So the passage of the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, aka Taft-Hartley, was a decisive historical turning point that legally locked the American working class into highly specific, disciplined organizational models that are legally bound. It didn't just weaken unions, it acted as a filtration mechanism. It systemically penalized the open-ended political and direct action methods of solidaristic unionism that characterized the prior, heroic period from the 1870s to the 1920s that set up the American labor process in the first place. While legally stabilizing a highly bureaucratized industrial unions, particularly after they purged the communists in 1951-52, and general unions, provided those unions act as regular, predictable managers of labor peace and maintain strikes within a very limited framework. All right. So how did Taft-Hartley really affect all of these types of unions? One, that it outlawed class-wide leverages. Secondary boycotts are effectively illegal. Sympathy strikes are illegal, and jurisdictional strikes are illegal. So disputes between different unions over who had the right to perform certain works was banned, which I actually don't have a problem with that one, but that's a big one. Entire cities could no longer go on strike to support a single embattled shop. That became illegal, although sometimes we try to find ways around it, and there are some ways around it, but there's not many. Unless you're willing to go on wildcat strike. But the union leadership doesn't want to do that because they use their legal representation immediately. If workers are a part of a factory went on strike, a solidaristic models allowed workers at the main assembly plant to refuse to handle those hard cargoes. Taft-Hartley made it illegal to pressure a neutral employer to stop doing business with a striking with an employer under strike conditions. They also basically, by stopping solidarity strikes and consolidation issues, stopped the ability of unions to come together to form a labor party, as is what happened in the All-German Labor League, led by Lassalle, which joined with the Eisenkachers, which became the SPD, are the formation of the Labor Party in Britain. By legally restricting this dispute only to the immediate employees and their immediate boss or firm, the law forced unions into a fragmented enterprise by enterprise box. We don't even get sectional bargaining in the United States. Sectional bargaining is the only reason we have anything that looks like social democracy in Scandinavia. Scandinavia does not have really strong minimum wage laws, for example. But you don't need them because they have sectional bargaining for all workers in a sector and everyone's in the union. Kind of. Industrial and general unions can survive this because they had legal machinery to fight shop by shop, as long as you were getting large shops at a time. So when you had factories, you could still survive this by getting, 2,000 employers in a factory. But the organic composition of capital means that factories are now down to smaller and smaller amounts of people. And so that doesn't work in the same way. And like when you're talking about like the Starbucks union, you're getting 40 people per shop. And when you talk about franchisees, you got two different levels of organizations to deal with. So you have to deal with both corporate and the franchise model, which have different rules. Service unions dealing with franchisees are at a massive disadvantage. It's part of why franchises were so pushed in the 20th century. All right, solidaristic models like the IWW, which relied on cross-shop class solidarity, were legally suffocated, and the IWW became what it is today, which is more of political advocacy, doing unionism, doing actual unions on the margins, and often not getting contracts. The other thing was the ability to mandate no strike clauses and other contractual enforcements, which Taft-Hartley made legal. Taft-Hartley made unions legally liable for damages if their members struck during the terms of a collective bargaining agreement. To avoid bankrupting lawsuits, industrial and general unions began writing no strike clauses in their contracts. This didn't matter for like guild unions because guild unions often are full of contractors anyway, and they don't bargain in the same way. This fundamentally transforms the role of union leadership. Now, I say this is actually important because one thing that I pointed out that like me and Sean from this wreckage are both in unions. But Sean is in a guild union, and I'm in effectively a guild union, but in a public sector guild union, which works entirely differently. So you don't have to join my union to get a teaching job. In fact, only about on average 20% of the workforce is in one of our unions, and we're the largest union in the state. So that tells you a lot, right? And we're even cagey on whether we're a union. We kind of play it both ways. We are highly pack organized and highly bureaucratic. I don't even get, in fact, no, even reps don't get a say on who we endorse. So endorsements come from staffers and from the pack, not from the membership at all. At all. Right. The only people who get to talk about this with the Uniserv directors and the staffers when it comes to endorsements who are running the pack is the president, as far as I know, and maybe very specific committees, which I don't know about and on, even though I'm on committees and anime rep. All right. Once the contract is signed, a union bureaucracy is legally obligated to act as a disciplined army of a company under Taft-Hartley. If rank and file workers walk out on a wildcat strike over a safety hazard, the union officials are forced to, by law, to tell them to go back to work or face the fines and asset seizures that are penalized in the contract. That's what it did. It also led to ideological purges. The most famous one was the purge of 11 full union from the CIO. These are the most radical left-leaning unions. And then the socialists, syndicalists, and communists were purged from the movement formally. And were replaced by labor professionals, which are lawyers, contract negotiators, and administrators, who have, since the 1960s, have largely been educated in business schools. This is my problem with some of the models of rank and file organizing. They actually are mostly still focused on staffers that have been popular in earlier iterations of DSA, such as some abuses of Jay McAlevy's work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because Jay McAlevey focused on political gains are often done by pack intercessors and staffers. She also encouraged rank and file involvement, though, so I don't want to come down on her like she's some kind of villain. She's not. She was a key thinker. But Section 9H of the Act actually required all union members to sign an affidavit swearing they were not members of the Communist Party and have never supported any organization that teaches to overthrow the U.S. government. When I worked in the for the state of Georgia as a adjunct professor, I had to sign one of these pledges saying that I'd never wanted to overthrow the state of Georgia. Actually, it didn't even give a shit about the federal government. It's like, did I want to overthrow the state of Georgia? Because they asked about the federal government. A lot of neo-Confederates would have been that shit out of luck, wouldn't they? But anyway, so this is a thing. Section 14B of Taft-Hartley also allows individual states to pass right-to-work laws. Although pure right-to-work laws don't exist. But these outlawed union shops, which agreements that require all workers benefiting from a union contract to pay dues or agency fees. So basically now I think everything is technically right to work. We don't have closed shops. Now, there are criticisms of closed shops that even come out of the sectional unions in Scandinavia who say it's closed shops. While they do get rid of the free rider problem, they often make the union bureaucracy even less responsive to membership because they're going to get your dues either way. So, yeah. So you have a severe free rider problem with right to works, but you also, if you have closed shop, you also have a bureaucratic problem that gets even worse. You have to figure out how to handle that. Cough, cough. That's why political labor parties are really important. So that's what Taft-Hartley did to all that. Let's talk about some examples of craft unions, for example. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the IBEW, the International Typographical Union, ITU. Like I said, depending on your state, your version of the NEA, so the UEA is actually a craft union. Whereas the NEA is not in other states. That's a weird thing, but it has to do with the way public sector unions set up their charters and deals with their state governments. So those are big examples. Most carpenter unions are craft unions. The freelancers union is a craft union. The writers union is a craft union. Industrial and business unions. So the United Steelworkers of America and the UAW in its original function. So until 2007, really, these were industrial unions. So the USWA, the early CIO, the United Auto Workers were all industrial unions. In 2007, in the great reshuffling of the auto unions and the financial market crash, the UAW really, a lot of its leadership was in prison for breaking the law. The UAW was literally one of the worst unions for that. It's been changed under Sean Fain's recent leadership. But the UAW goes on strike. You still have stuff like stand-up strikes to strategically paralyze corporate manufacturing simultaneously. So Sean Fain has tried to return the industrial union language, but not the industrial union structure because they can't. There's just not enough. The union laws in the South for a lot of these other plants are too hard to overcome, and as there started to be auto workers unions and stuff making cores in the South, the southern states changed their laws to make it even fucking harder. It's kind of like in Colorado. It's really hard to have a union because you have to have like a 60% vote twice. But anyway. So the general unions, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters is a general union. It's always been a general union. Started by Trotskyist way back in the day. It was tied to the SWP, but it's tended to be more conservative over time. It's stated as a general union means it handles a highly diverse array of workers, most famously UPS, but also warehouse workers, zookeepers, airline pilots, sometimes school drivers, depending on the state and if they're involved in the NEA. Dairy workers can all be in the Teamsters. Also, because of this, Teamsters tend to have an enormous strike fund and a diversified financial base to protect power, but they also tend to be very conservative. Also, frankly, the Teamsters had, because of this decentralized base, they often kept it together through deals with unsavory agencies. A contemporary model of this hybrid is all the teachers unions. We have the ATA, with the AFT, and the NEA, and the modern UAW. Because manufacturers' jobs were hollowed out by deindustrialization, the UAW survived by transforming itself into a general union. It represents tens of thousands of academic workers, particularly in Harvard, Columbia, and the universities of California. They also sometimes represent legal aid attorneys and gaming enterprise workers in casinos and in sometimes tabletop games. Cutting into the jurisdictions of other unions, though. So now you have jurisdictional competition between unions. This is real fun. This is something that we have to be very careful about in my worker center. Well, not mine. I'm not I don't own it, but the worker center I'm in. There we go. This historical direct action unions. There's the IWW, and I can't find another example in the United States, but I guess the CGT in France is the closest thing I can think to it. So one of the big problems with craft unions is they're highly subject to technological obsolescence, and they do tend to favor labor aristocratic unionisms that actually sometimes fight other sectors because those sectors then are in competition for each other. And so sometimes you'll have electricians, carpenters, drivers, and actors fighting each other over their rights. The industrial unions had massive bureaucratization and were given a capital flight. They were particularly weakened by outsourcing and organic capital composition, so automation. General unions are basically service providers, and they pivot largely like a commercial insurance model. This is kind of what my union does, actually. They try to handle that. They also tend to be politically inert because they are even conservative because they tend to be low risk lobbies. The campaign donations tend to go to the Democratic Party, with the exceptions of the Teamsters. And actually, my union gives a lot to certain Republicans to fight other Republicans, to be quite honest. Spending millions of member dues on electoral politics that rarely result in structural gains for even them. And then the problems with solidarist direct action unions are the same problems that I talked about with the LATU. Now, why did I go, off this? Now I want to talk a little bit about public sector unions. I know this episode is running long, but like when I covered the different kinds of NGOs, which is an episode none of you fucking watched. Why is it the most important episodes that I think that I go in and actually explain all the nitty gritty details of shit are the things that no one watches? Look, I'm an underwatched YouTuber anyway, because I know watching someone lecture you for an hour from a chair is not particularly fun. I don't do video essays. Yeah. All right. Public sector union operates differently than any of those other unions, so that's why I'm covering them separately. But they're the largest sector of unions in the United States. The core structural difference is that the target of public sector unions is not profit. They are not dependent on profit. There is no profit margin for them to be dependent on. Their leverage is political and only financial, in so much that it affects the political. Public sector workers are unique because they are simultaneously employees of the state and voters who elect bosses who manage the state. This creates a circular political dynamic. Public sector unions donate heavily to political campaigns to elect the very politicians that will later sit across from them at the bargaining table, which is why there's a lot of anger at public sector unions. However, if they don't have that, they're often hyper-exploited, as we saw in the 20th century. A strike by sanitation workers, teachers, or social workers doesn't cost the governor or mayor money. It costs them political capital and can cost their cities money indirectly. It inconveniences the public, creating an administrative crisis, but it doesn't really change profit rates at all. There are also two different sectors of public sector unions, and they have different failures. So the civil service and professional unions, which are teachers, transit, federal workers. Examples included the AFT, the NEA, the AFSCME, and the AFGE. By the way, in addition to my worker center and the small unions I was talking about, like the Suntrap United, which is a gay bar that is unionized, the Ski Patrollers Union, which is I don't know how we would say they are. They're kind of a service union. The other ones that are really represented, it's not actually the NEA or the AFT, but AFSCME, AFSCME is how it's often pronounced, and the CWA are overwhelmingly represented in my workers union, as well as pre-majority nursing people who are often tied to the the ASCMA because they work for the university, even though they work for hospitals. So, something you can look at, because they're employers of the state, a change in administration can instantly rewrite their working conditions or strip their rights by executive fiat or by legislative fiat. Federal workers unions have faced existential threats from sweeping executive orders from Reagan to Trump, such as attempting to reclassify large swaths of the civil service to strip collective bargaining rights or fast-track reductions and force rifts that lead these unions constantly fighting exhausting multi-year defensive holding actions to survive. There's also usually a ban on striking. In a vast majority of states and at the federal level, public employees are barred from striking. Federal employees don't strike, otherwise they would. There have been federal employee strikes. They were wildcat. That's how we got public sector unions, was the wildcat stripes in the post office, which actually led to going postal later on, which, there are several violent events in post offices. The historic benchmark remains the 1981 Pacto strike, where striking federal air traffic controllers were summarily fired and blacklisted by Ronald Reagan. Without the legal right to strike, these unions are almost entirely slow defensive legal and electoral lobbying units. They're important as electoral lobbying units for the reason I said above. The leverage is political, but, they're also given a fiscal authority, particularly because state and city budgets, where most of the unions are, don't have currency sovereignty. So when they have a budget crisis, the public sector unions are easily cast by politicians and the media as parasites draining the public dollars. And sometimes they actually, I'm not saying they are parasites, that's not my point, but sometimes they actually do drain the public dollars. They are forced into a zero-sum game where they either must accept raise, raises, and pension cuts or get their coworkers laid off, leaving them structurally incapable of going on a strike offensive. And also, there is a severe money limit. I've actually commented that, for example, many local governments are actually more fiscally constrained than private industry because local governments have more debt limits, and the structuring of bonds also limits how they can do things. So the other thing that you have to deal with is the fact that the public unions are often part of the explicit repressive apparatus, and this leads us to the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, and the IUPA, the International Union of Police, and the prison guards unions, which I've never been a member of, actually, even though I was once a corrections officer. Which, by the way, as a side note, I don't talk about it a lot. And I have said that I am a police abolitionist insofar that I believe that in a socialist society that would be handled by conscription and universal militia duties for domestic peace work, which makes me incredibly unpopular because I don't think you can just throw all the social services at it and just make it go away by like social work. Although if you have better social work and better services and a better society, you'd have a lot less of it. But not all crime would go away just by getting rid of crimes related to poverty. So you'd still, and some of them will be violent, you would still need some kind of peacekeeping apparatus for that. But for most societies, for most of history, prior to the invention of modern policing and the occupation of Ireland is the earliest thing I can find for modern policing. Although you could argue that the sheriff tax revenue and the election of sheriffs is a form of policing. But prior to that, most policing was actually done by the military, even domestically, or by the king himself, which is pre-modern and pre-capitalist. Anyway, but my point is that in earlier societies, the peace was kept by like deputization, which in like English common law was unpaid conscription, believe it or not. And it kind of was out west too, when most of the people had to do that. So you have the various repressive apparatuses, which, after the teachers' unions, the largest unions are the Fraternal Order of Police. From a traditional socialist or left-wing standpoint, police unions represent a structural contradiction. They are the organizations of state agents whose primary job it is to enforce property relations and to suppress working class rebellions, as well as keep the general peace. Unlike teachers' unions, which are routinely targeted for austerity, police unions have been incredibly successful at using political pressure to insulate themselves from public accountability. Even when they lose money, they often have things like the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights and state laws, which protect officers from investigation, blocking qualified immunity, and drain municipal budgets when qualified immunity is actually really not respected through massive misconduct settlements. So there's no class solidarity with the police unions, but they're in the AFL-CIO because not everywhere, but they are, because they're one of the largest union sectors. Police unions often operate in total isolation from the broader labor movement, even the other public sector unions. although it is noted that teachers unions tend to vote somewhat, and firemen's unions tend to vote somewhat similarly to the police unions, but that largely has to do with like how they get funding in their area. So all these are limited. So I've also I mean, there are under autonomous dues funded models. So if I want to talk about unions, like the most, so public sector unions and their examples: civil service unions, ADA, AFT, AFSCE, repressive apparatus unions, police, period, just police. We don't have army unions, probably for good reason. But anyway, we don't have them. So I've talked about tenants unions, and let's talk about some of the other autonomous dues funded model. The biggest one we talked about, of course, was the LA Tenants Union. There's also the ATUN, which is the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, and that consists of like the Crown Heights Tenant Union in Brooklyn, the Tenant Union and Neighborhood Councils in the Bay Area, TNAC. I'm going to point out, though, that all these unions are in fairly rich metropoles. They still remain downstream of progressive politics. I don't know what to make of that, but until you have a socialist politics that actually has inroads into the suburban, exurban, and rural areas, you're going to be really strategically limited as a subset of the Democratic Party, even when you're autonomous from it, because that's who you're fucking dealing with. All right, so what about the city-wide unions? There's also the KC tenants unions. This was founded in 2019. The Kansas City, Missouri tenant unions grew out of a mostly structural discipline and sophisticated unions in the country. They're a multi-tiered operation, but they pivoted to political infrastructure. So they launched KT Tenants Power, a sibling union that intervenes in municipal elections. They're basically like a little mini tenants DSA. The model achieves mass scale and delivers concrete material gains, but it operates right on the edge of the NGO electoral matrix, kind of like DSA does. By engaging directly with city council legislative reform, it constantly risks losing its momentum into regularized state action policies. So that's the other real model, is the city-wide political hybrid model for tenants unions. And I could talk a little bit about more in the KC union, the KC tenant strikes. So if you look sources at KC tenants during the historic simultaneous strikes at the Independent Towers and Quality Hill Towers, these campaigns perfectly illustrate the two dynamics in real time. They do have autonomous action like the autonomous unions, but they're also both had institutional pivots. The KC tenants unions built pressure toward the pressure of the federal government, particularly Fannie Mae and the FHFA, to win debt forgiveness, and they got into electing people to this city council, but they have to be they're on a structural tightrope because they basically have to deal with codified law, and there is real worries that eventually we'll get something like a Taft-Hartley for tenants unions. One of the reasons, and I want to talk about all these structures and go back to tenants unions a bit, though, is I want to talk about the difference between scads versus eviction, which is an asymmetry of the safety net. When a labor union fails, the absolute worst case scenario for the worker is generally losing their job. While economically devastating, the worker still retains physical shelter, their community, and their personal belongings if they're through the welfare state, and they can look for another job. And often, if the market is good, they can find one relatively quickly. When a rent strike fails, there's immediate physical displacement through eviction, and often there's a blacklist. So a worker strike can goes on at home. At the end of the day, secure space. A tenant or strike is risking the roof over their head and their family's well-being. Now, that's still true for labor unions. I want to be clear on that. But in the modern housing market, an eviction filing is digitized instantly, and landlords use tenant screening software databases to see who's been blacklisted with an eviction record. If a worker loses their job, they can find employment elsewhere. Blacklists happen, but they're generally not legal. They do happen. A tenant with an eviction record is effectively locked out of formal housing market for years. All right. So they have to go to private housing or more precarious forms of housing or find other people to live with who can get the lease first. The state's legal and enforcement architecture is heavily raised towards the defense of private property, particularly real estate property. The mechanics of eviction are designed to be swift, administrative, and backed by state violence immediately. In a labor strike, an employment league cannot easily use the police to force striking workers back onto the assembly line. They have tried, but the legal battles play out thoroughly through injunctions, legislative actions, the NLRB, and a ring strike. Once the landlord secures an eviction order through a specialized high-volume housing court, the state will deploy its armed forces, which are sheriffs, marshals, bailiff, cops, to physically eject the tenant and throw their belongings onto the street. The time horizon from the start of a wind strike to physical removal can be a matter of weeks, even if it takes months to get the eviction notice, giving the organization very little time to sustainably build pressure. That's a real problem. Okay. Which means you also, a tenant union to be really successful would also have to have what we might call tenant perfection funds, which is the ability to like house people if they lose. And I don't think any tenant union in the country has that. Labor strikes usually target single corporate industries or industry-wide associations that consolidate capital. If the UAW strikes GM, they are fighting a centralized board of directors with a visible supply chain, public stocks, and disruptions to downstream production. So there's also pressure from other parts of capital to get everything back up, even if it means the capitalist has to make concessions. The housing market is hyper-fragmented and intentionally obscured through corporate nesting dolls. A tenant will face a property managing company and maybe a shell company, and then maybe even a private equity fund or a small-time millionaire. A tenants union trying to coordinate a rent strike discovers that 500 units in their neighborhood are legally owned by a dozen different LLCs, even if they ultimately feed into the same fund or private equity fund or public equity fund for that matter. This makes it incredibly difficult to achieve a single centralized bargaining table. There's also a cash flow neutralization trap, which is a problem with YIMBYism too. In a labor strike, the goal is to halt production so capitalists lose money immediately and cannot fulfill their contracts, which causes a break in the chain. The money is not paid to striking workers, remains in the company's unearned potential, but their machinery sits idle, their stock depreciates, and their losses go through. In a rent strike, tenants hold cash. However, to maintain any legal defense against immediate eviction in the course of law, tenants are almost always legally required to pay their rent in a court-controlled escrow account. Yeah, that's a thing. If tenants do not put money into escrow, the judge will throw out the defense and order an immediate eviction for non-payment. If tenants do put money in escrow, the cash is legally locked up. While the landlord cannot access this immediately, the landlord knows the money exists and will eventually be distributed by a judge, even if it's at lower rates than the landlord is asking. The landlord's long-term capital valuation remains secure, severely blunting the psychological and economic pain of the strike. Lastly, and this is another problem, even if the landlord wishes to lose this form of capital and can't deal with the escrow problem, what will happen next is that they can set on their property as added to the currently value as an investment. And then they can even use that to say they're going to move into the property and evict the current resident by doing so in most places in the country. And this is start for the United States. It may work differently in other countries. This is also why trying to generalize tenants unions from state to state is hard, but it's almost impossible to generalize them from country to country. So there's a structural asymmetry of pressure. The other thing is the safety net. When a labor strike fails, the absolute worst case scenario for the worker is losing their job. While economically devastating, the worker still retains, most of their stuff. In the short term anyway. The scab is a threat for the job loss because they can maintain the job. But if you can physically stop the scab, you have an issue. These are all things that are hard to deal with. So, yeah. So why do I think we need a party? I clearly think I've pointed out the structural problems with every single one of these formations, and they're not all traditional labor unions, although I did add that into the conversation. The reason why you need a party is none of them can successfully operate by themselves without some coordinating factor that also can deal political leverage. The best way for a party such as that to exist is to be a party that is disciplined and responsive to a certain class and can work to coordinate and operate in clear ways for these organizations to to operate more clearly, or if need be, defend them by whatever mean they can defend them. And you can figure out what I'm implying by that. Whether it be legal or extra legal. Parties also can coordinate militia actions, they can coordinate electoral actions, they can coordinate obstruction. Parties are not NGOs because a party needs to be able to spend as it needs to and as it likes. An NGO is legally constrained or it will lose its NGO status. This is why it is necessary for a party to exist, but why I've often said we are in a pre-party moment right now. The DSA is structurally limited, and while I think it's valuable as the primary place socialists are in America and our weird intersection with progressives, I think it can be dangerous and fall into Bonapartist and class collaborationist tendencies if we're not careful, or it can only represent white-collar workers downstream and progressives, which is kind of what it's doing right now. It also tends, because of the tension in what these demands are, to represent specific sectors of capital, or white collar workers, and prioritize those sectors over all others. It is not well represented in suburban areas. It is mostly strong in areas that are already dominated by progressives. And while it is a successful political mechanism on pushing progressives to actually act out their left-wing promises sometimes, in no case do they have the ability to control their electeds, to discipline them, and to block their committee appointments, to deny them money. All they can really do is help them get to office by foot traffic and by canvassing. But we need something that coordinates this all together. I am a supporter of the partyist faction in the DSA if we actually structure the DSA eventually like a party, which its current charter is not done as, and its current legal status does not do. But I also think we need the tenants unions, whatever their legal structures are. We need the other forms of unions, and we need to come up with new forms of organization. If we come up with community organizations that actually did more than like community organizing or Alinsky bullshit, because that was better used by the right than by the left for reasons of class collaboration. And the other thing is class collaborative interests tend to lead to Bonapartist politics because you need a strong central authority to mediate the differences and the control the differences between the different groups. Now, this has been a longer episode. So instead of breaking up into two, which I've noticed sometimes lead to people not watching the second episode, I'm just going to keep the whole thing up in one episode this time. This is mostly from my own knowledge base. So I did look some stuff up. But I hope this helps you in navigating the various structures that we might need. And I hope that you understand that I respect the LATU, that I respect the UAW, that I respect the IWW, that I respect parts of the DSA. That's why I'm in it. Even though I critiqued it for years and said I'd never join it. And sometimes I don't know why I'm in it. I do know why though, because it's where the leftists are, and we either have to become a party or we have to split. Because we also don't need 1,000 sects who tie people into basically cargo cults that don't actually do anything but protest. Because who cares? And protesting does effectively make them like the radical wing of capital of progressive politics. They can be used as a filter off, but they rarely ever have the mass to grow. And since they're based off of like cell structures that are based off wartime organizations, like the Bolsheviks in 1921 or when they were illegal, they often have very weird limits that don't interface well with the general public. Um, the sects are also a problem. And while I do not think you're going to get rid of factions, because even in places with faction bans, there are de facto real factions. Um, Sometimes people try to get around them by being informal. I think that's true for France Unbowed, unfortunately, even though I respect France Unbowed. I want to be clear about that. Sometimes they uh, uh, lead to civil wars and purges, and sometimes you do have to purge movements and parties. But like the idea that you get stronger by just ideological enforcement is crazy to me. That wasn't even true for the Bolsheviks. They never did that kind of ideological enforcement. Even during the Stalin period, where there were mass purges across ideological lines, there was still ideological diversity in the party. I just like it. I think it's better formalized and more honest with factions, and it keeps the need for sect to developing by keeping people who advocate for certain beliefs in the union. It's a Catholic model rather than a Protestant model to make a stupid Christian allegory. You'd rather have, the Franciscans and the Jansenists and whoever, as long as they're within a basic borderline of minimum structure within the same unit, even if they have vastly different advocacy and beliefs, than have them split over every fucking thing. But anyway, that's my personal beliefs. I do think we are going to be at a crossroads. The partyist model is becoming more popular in the DSA. Now there's a big endorsement model. I still think a lot of those people don't think, like, I don't think a lot of them think you're going to vote socialism into office, but I do think they're going to get around structural traps that they're not going to get around very easily, that we aren't going to get around very easily. Really hard on the we and they stuff here because I very much am in this organization. I pay dues. I actually pay a high rate of dues. But I don't identify very much with the electoral ring, particularly right now, because it seems to go back to the undisciplined days of like 2016. And while there is quick cadre growth from that, there's also a lot of quick failure when these politicians structurally, even if they want to, can't deliver what people want because of budget constraints, physical constraints, etc. And we're about to be in austerity season. So a whole lot of state level largesse. It seems weird to be doing that, running straight into austerity. And it's weird to me that the people who used to critique hyper localism have all become super socialist all the fucking sudden. Now, I think you build power locally first and reign up. And so I'm not even unsympathetic to that. But I think you need to do it through clear class lines, multiple strands of battle, not just electoral, which I think most DSAers and stuff would agree with me, but not just protest either. And probably some things that we don't currently have on the left. And I'll just leave it at that. Protect your peace, like and subscribe, and keep fighting for a better tomorrow. Have a great day.